When talking about the greats in Overwatch history, it feels wrong to not go over Prophet, a champion of the inaugural season, Finals MVP, and one of the greatest Overwatch players of all time. Prophet dominated in the early days of Overwatch esports, setting the standard for DPS play, and even as the game progressed and players got better, Prophet still kept up and remained a top tier player for many years. Today, I'm going to take a deep dive into Prophet's entire career, from before the Overwatch League to his final game, and see what makes this guy just so special. I'll be making more videos on other Overwatch League players, so leave a comment down below or at me on Twitter, twitter.com/deathowl, link in the description, to let me know who you'd want to see next. If you like Overwatch videos and you want to see more, then, With that said, let's go all the way back to where it all began, on a little known roster called GC Busan. Sometime in 2017, Prophet would emerge as an up-and-coming DPS prospect, getting signed to a new team to compete in Apex Season 4. This team, GC Busan, would also feature players you may recognize like Jester, Hureg, Hagapun, and Closer. GC Busan kinda came out of nowhere, catching fans off guard by making it through both group stages, and after managing to take down C9 Kongdu, they would later face off against Runaway, a team on the rise, which sported players who would later become the 2019 Vancouver Titans, like Hoxel, Stitch, Jono, and Bumper. I don't know what it was, but for some reason, almost every single Apex final always seemed to go the distance, and this Apex final was nothing short of insane, this time being a 7-map slugfest where both teams were only a few teamfights away from taking the whole tournament. Throughout the series, Prophet would show off his nasty Tracer and Genji, and really show everyone that he was one of the best players in the game. By the end of the series, GC Busan had secured a 4-3 victory, and Prophet was crowned Finals MVP. It was official. This guy was good. Really good. So good, in fact, that even the casters could barely contain their excitement. It was like they knew they were watching the birth of something special, and as we moved into the Overwatch League, Prophet was only getting started. In November of 2017, Prophet and the rest of the GC Busan squad were signed to the London Spitfire, which was essentially Cloud9's Overwatch League franchise. London's roster was stacked with talent, with most of his team signing with him, as well as the additions of many other players like Birdring, Fury, and Badosin. But it was Prophet who quickly became the face of the team. He wasn't just a good DPS player, he was elite. The 2018 season was insane for the Spitfire, and they set the bar high early. Prophet wasn't just along for the ride either. He was one of the reasons that London was winning games, and the Spitfire would finish Stage 1 with a 7-3 record, which was good enough for the number 3 seed. In the title matches, the Spitfire would take down the Houston Outlaws, and would move on to face the New York Excelsior in the Stage 1 finals. Spitfire would start out really slow, going down 0-2, but Prophet and his new teammate Birdring would clutch up in the later maps, and compete the first finals reverse sweep in Overwatch League history, taking home their first stage title. The rest of the season was pretty successful, going 24-16, and although they didn't make any more stage finals, their record was still good enough for the number 5 seed in the playoffs. Now, something to note, in the inaugural season of the Overwatch League, the playoff games were played in a series like the NBA. With each full series the team won, it would add to a 1-3 point. In the playoffs, they would face off against the 4 seed LA Gladiators and beat them 2-1, losing 0-3 in the first series, but sweeping the Glads in the following 2. Winning 6-0 and moving on to the semifinals. They would move on to face the other LA team, the 2-seeded LA Valiant, and they would take them down in a shocking 2-0. Jester and Prophet showed up big, and this duo would continue to dominate. They ended up meeting the 6-seed Philadelphia Fusion in the Grand Finals, who had just upset the number 1 seed NYXL in order to make it here. However, if you know anything about the Fusion, they never win anything, and the London Spitfire would kinda dominate their way through the finals, with Prophet earning Finals MVP for his efforts. This was an incredible season for Prophet, and although he would never quite get to this point again, his career was only getting started. As you may or may not know, 2019 was the year of the GOATS meta, and we had to witness the Prophet Zarya, which was pretty cursed to see. However, Prophet was by no means bad at Zarya. Unfortunately though, the GOATS meta was just not really the Spitfire's strong suit, and they really struggled throughout the season, starting out Stage 1, 3, and 4. However, things would start to click, as Prophet would branch out, still playing his Zarya, but he would also play things like Sombra and even Wrecking Ball at some points. Yeah, the Prophet Wrecking Ball was not something I ever thought I'd see. I kinda forgot about it and I wish I never remembered it, but here we are. In Stage 2, the Spitfire would go 6-1 and make it to the tournament. However, they weren't as successful in the tournament, as Gushue and the Spark took them down 3-1 in the first round. This loss really must have shaken them up, because in Stage 3, they reverted and went 3-4 again. In Stage 4, GOATS was finally over, and Profit was able to play DPS again. The Spitfire would improve a little bit, but they would still struggle against the top teams, and would go 4-3. At the end of the season, the Spitfire would finish 16-12, which was luckily still good enough to qualify for the play-ins. In said play-ins, the Spitfire would go up against the Shanghai Dragons, the team that had won the Stage 3 title earlier after having a crazy comeback year after their 0-40 season. The Spitfire and Dragons would go back and forth in a series that was honestly way better than I remembered, going the distance across 8 fucking maps, where the Spitfire just barely came out on top 4-3. The Dragons and Spitfire seemed to be pretty evenly matched, but Profit simply refused to miss the playoffs, going nuclear in the final few maps and clutching up when it matters the most, taking the Spitfire to the playoffs. However, the playoffs would not go as they hoped. They got beaten 4-1 by the New York Excelsior in round 1, and then 4-0 by the Shock in round 2 in the lower bracket. Unfortunately, they ended up starting off the Shock's lower bracket run, and they had to go up against 2 of the top 3 teams back-to-back and were eliminated in the first round. Despite the early exit though, making it to the playoffs is a success, putting up a fight against 2 of the top 3 teams is a success, and Profit yet again put up a really good season. In 2020, the London Spitfire Profit era came to an end, as he swapped teams over to the Seoul Dynasty, alongside his longtime duo, Gesture. These two had been playing together since the beginning on GC Busan, and would play together for Gesture's entire career until he retired. The Dynasty had a pretty good roster in 2020, with Profit being surrounded by players like Fitz, Marvel, Toby, and Creative. However, the 2020 season was thrown into chaos as the pandemic hit, causing the season to end up being virtual. This was pretty rough for the Dynasty, and they found themselves struggling, going 1-3 in May and placing last in APAC. However, in 2020, every team was allowed to participate in the stage tournament, and in the May Melee, the Dynasty, who had the 7 seed, stepped it up and started winning games. In the first round, they upset the number 4 seed Hangzhou Spark, swapping up their comp and utilizing Profit on the new hero, Echo. The Dynasty would continue their miracle run, upsetting the number 1 seed Guangzhou Charge in a wild 5-map series that went the complete distance. Once again, Profit would win MVP for his efforts, coming up clutch when it mattered to help elevate his team to a level they didn't think was possible. However, all great things must come to an end, as the Dynasty faced off against the number 2 seed Shanghai Dragons. The Dynasty actually went up 3-0 on the Dragons, looking like the miracle run might go all the way. But in map 4, the Dragons made the wise choice to sub out Stand 1 and DM, and sub in Fearless and Lip. And with these players now in, they reinvigorated the Dragons, who went on to complete the biggest reverse sweep in Overwatch League history, beating the Dynasty 4-3. Despite being on the wrong side of history and one of the most brutal losses ever, this was still an incredible run for the Dynasty, and they headed into the Summer Showdown with a lot of hope. However, this meta ended up not being the best for them, despite Profit playing pretty well on his signature Genji. They finished 1-3, but in the bracket, they took down Profit's old team, the London Spitfire, before getting eliminated by the Dragons in the semifinals. In the Countdown Cup, the Dynasty would go 0-3 and lose to the Spark 2-3 in the first round, and it kinda looked like things were over for the 2020 Dynasty. However, they started to look up, as the Dynasty would finish off the season by going 4-1 in August. Finishing with a record of 12-12, they would be the 5th seed heading into the playoffs. However, now we need to talk about the disaster that was the 2020 playoffs. I've talked about how much I don't really like the 2020 playoffs in good detail before, but man, this was such a disaster. For starters, every single team made the playoffs, including the bad ones, and including the Seoul Dynasty. On top of this, the meta changed right before the playoffs, and it was a really chaotic, kinda dumb meta, but the Dynasty really thrived in it. They put Gesture on Roadhog and allowed Profit to play a wide variety of heroes, like Pharah, Hanzo, Ashe, Tracer, and more. In the play-ins, the Dynasty took down the Spark 3-0 and moved on to face the dominant Guangzhou Charge, who had been good all year with Shu and Krong leading the way. However, their good season meant nothing in the 2020 playoffs, as the Dynasty ran through them 3-0, moving on to face the Dragons for the first playoff spot. Unfortunately, the Dragons would come out on top in a very close game 3-2, and the Dynasty would fall to the lower bracket to face the number 2 seed NYXL. Luckily for Seoul, this meta was just so perfect for them, and they took full advantage, stopping the NYXL 3-0 and claiming the second Asia playoff spot. In round 1 of the international playoffs, the Dynasty would lose a very close game to the San Francisco Shock, and would end up beating the Fusion 3-0 in the lower bracket. They moved on to face the Shanghai Dragons, who had beaten them all year. However, this time, Profit and the Dynasty got the last laugh, as they beat them in a narrow 3-2 victory. Profit yet again came up huge in the clutch, coming back from a 1-2 deficit, and he won MVP for this match and moved on to face the Shocks in the finals. Unfortunately, the miracle run came to an end at the hands of a 2-4 loss to the San Francisco Shock. But the fact that this team was able to claw their way all the way to the grand finals was really impressive, and it only further cemented Profit's legacy as one of the greatest and most clutch players ever. In fact, people had already started to begin to call Profit the Overwatch GOAT as we headed into the 2021 season. The Dynasty looked scary in 2021, losing some unneeded players and having a smaller yet stronger roster. Profit and Fitz, or the Profits duo, became known pretty worldwide, and Sebulbi joining them gave them even more hype. Chester, Marvel, and Tuyu were a pretty scary tank line, and Animo, who was still in his prime at the time, alongside Creative, was a pretty solid backline. The Dynasty started out 3-1, only losing to the undefeated Philadelphia Fusion, which gave them the 2 seed. However, both the Fusion and Dynasty would be upset by the Hunter and Dragons, and would miss out on the May Melee tournament. This was kind of the story of the Dynasty's season, going 3-1 in every single stage, and losing one game short of the tournament more times than not. However, in the Countdown Cup, they ended up beating the Fusion in the knockouts and actually made it to the tournament for the first time. However, that victory would be kinda short-lived, as they'd be beaten by the Rain and Hunters and sent home in 4th place. Despite the struggles in the tournaments, the Dynasty still finished with a 12-4 record, which was one of the best in the league and set them up with the 3rd seed and the top seed in the play-ins. However, the 2021 Dynasty could just never get it done when it mattered. They would get upset by the Philadelphia Fusion and miss out on the playoffs entirely despite going 12-4. Things seemed kinda bleak for the Dynasty, but in 2022, everything kinda changed. In the 2021 offseason, the Dynasty made some major moves. They signed rookie DPS Stalker, who you may know now as one of the best DPS players of all time. They also signed legendary, super flexible tank player Smurf, as well as rookie main support Vindame. Creative was also on the roster, but QB later traded for Iris. And with Profit and Fitz still on the roster, this team looked stacked heading into 2022. As stacked as they were, in the kickoff clash, they would go 4-2, getting the 3rd seed. And they would lose in a very, very close game to the Dragons in the first round, sending them to the lower bracket early. However, this is where Profit would unleash that 2018 playoff Profit energy, and would dominate in this lower bracket, simply refusing to lose and willing his team to victory. They swept the Spark in round 1 and moved on to the lower bracket finals to face off against the Shanghai Dragons in a bitter rematch. This match certainly went the distance, and it was pretty clear how evenly matched these teams were, but at map 5, Profit clutched up and led the Dynasty to continue on and roll, sweeping the Philadelphia Fusion in the finals 4-0, and giving Profit his 3rd straight MVP of the tournament and taking home the Kickoff Clash title. In the midseason madness, the Dynasty would go 5-1 and look to be a top contender in the tournament. However, they'd get upset by the Hangzhou Spark in the first round, and would be upset again by the Atlanta Rain in a close game in the lower bracket, eliminating them in the second round. Despite this pretty tough loss, they would continue to play well as we headed into the Summer Showdown, which was headlined by the Jotes meta. This meta was really strange: Junker Queen, Sojourn, Genji, and double main support. However, rookie DPS Stalker ended up coming off the bench to play Genji, while Profit was put on Brig duty, since, double main support meta. Despite this off-rolling, the Dynasty were actually really good, going 5-1 yet again and being one of the best teams in this meta. In the tournament, the Dynasty would beat the Fusion twice, once in the upper bracket and once in the lower, but they just couldn't get past the Who Are You and lip-led Shanghai Dragons, and in the grand finals, they would fall 2-4 in a pretty close series, placing second. they'd finish out the season 5-1 and would end the year with a 19-5 record, which is good enough for the number 1 seed in APAC and the number 4 seed overall. In the playoffs, they would beat the Mayhem 3-0 before falling to the eventual champion Dallas Fuel. In the lower bracket, they would unfortunately cross paths with the San Francisco Shock pretty early, the other finals team, and they'd be eliminated early by them, finishing top 6. Despite this loss, losing to both finals teams was nothing to scoff at, and honestly, still another pretty good season from Prophet. At the end of the 2022 season, rumors were circulating that Prophet was finally going to retire, and it seemed like that was his plan. But he ended up running it back with the Dynasty for one last legacy year, mainly just playing with his friends and having a good time, not taking the season as seriously as he had before. However, even when he wasn't giving it 100%, Prophet is still a top tier DPS, and he helped lead the Dynasty to some really good wins. Seoul struggled in the early part of the season, going 1-4, and Prophet ended up having to take a step back from playing for personal reasons, which led rookie DPS Seonjun to take his place. Despite Seonjun actually playing pretty good, the Dynasty would not qualify for the Mid-Season Madness, and in the second half of the season, the Dynasty would have to step it up, which they did. The Dynasty would end up finishing out the season 5-3, with Prophet winning MVP in all 5 of their wins, which is absurd, honestly. The Dynasty finished with a 6-7 record, and in the knockouts, Prophet and the Dynasty turned it up even more. Despite an early loss to O2 Blast, they would storm through the lower bracket, eliminating both Sinprisa Gaming and the Guangzhou Charge, narrowly beating the Seoul Infernal in a close map 5, and would make it all the way to the Grand Finals to face off against O2 Blast in a revenge game. This series would be brutal and somewhat one-sided, as Prophet & Co. would beat down O2 Blast 4-1, winning their group and taking home their stage tournament. Despite quite literally winning their group, they were kinda only fighting for pride at this point in the season, as their record wasn't quite good enough for the playoffs. So even though they won, they didn't qualify. Despite this, Prophet still ended his career on a high note. What a way to go out. He won a tournament, made it all the way through, and that's it. After a brief stint playing in Flash Ops, Prophet would officially announce his retirement on February 20th, 2024. One of the longest and most decorated careers in Overwatch League history would finally come to an end, and man, what a career he had. Prophet played in every single season of the Overwatch League, winning 2 stage tournaments, making it to 2 grand finals, and being one of the first ever Overwatch League champions. Prophet's career was one of the longest ever, managing to stay at the top of the pack for over 7 years, and the legacy he left behind will never be forgotten. The Overwatch League would simply not be the same without Prophet, and I'm glad he was able to play in every single season that the Overwatch League existed in. I really miss getting to watch him play, but I hope retirement is treating him well as he pursues the other parts of his life. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you liked this video. These things only take a few seconds, and they help me out more than you could imagine, so it'd be really appreciated. I have finals week coming up, so I'm probably not going to have a video made next week, but I have a Twitter and a TikTok linked in the description, so follow me there for more. I appreciate all the support I've received in this last year, and I look forward to making more content in the future. With that said though, thank you so much for watching.